The knock came at 11:47 p.m. I remember the time exactly because I was staring at my phone when it happened, watching the seconds tick by on a countdown timer that had nothing to do with the person standing outside my door. 3 sharp knocks. Not the lazy rhythm of a neighbor, not the hesitant tap of a delivery driver double checking an address. This was deliberate, practiced. The knock of someone who had done this before at other doors, to other people, and had never once had to explain themselves to the police afterward. I didn't move from the couch right away. I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further. I am not the kind of person you'd pick out of a crowd as someone worth targeting. I don't drive anything flashy. My apartment is the kind of place real estate agents describe as cozy, which is a polite way of saying small. I don't post vacation photos. I don't flex watches or shoes or any of the things that tell a stranger, this one has money to burn. And yet, 3 weeks earlier, I had become the single most interesting name on a list that I didn't know existed. A list built not from what I owned, but from what I had almost lost, and how quietly I had gotten it back. Let me back up further, because the knock at 11:47 only makes sense if you know what happened at 12:15 that afternoon, when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, area code from 3 states away. I almost let it go to voicemail. That single decision, answer or ignore, is the hinge this entire story swings on, and I think about it more than I probably should. Is this regarding your car's extended warranty? No, it was worse than that and somehow also more convincing. A calm, professional voice told me she was calling from my bank's fraud department. She had my last 4 digits, she had my address. She even had the name of the branch I'd opened my account at 9 years ago, a detail I'd forgotten myself until she said it back to me like she was reading it off a birthday card. There had been, she explained, unusual activity on my account, a transfer attempt from an unfamiliar device. Did I want to secure my funds before the transaction cleared? Here is the part where most people would have felt their stomach drop. Here is the part where fear starts doing the thinking for you, where your hands get slightly cold and your mind starts running through every dollar you have and every dollar you owe, multiplying panic by uncertainty until the two of them together are steering the car. I felt that. I won't pretend I didn't. For about 4 seconds, I was exactly the person she wanted me to be. Then something in the back of my head, call it instinct, call it a decade of watching true crime documentaries with my mother, call it plain stubbornness, started asking questions instead of answering them. Real banks don't call and ask you to verify your full account number over the phone. Real banks don't need you to download an app to secure anything. Real banks especially don't get impatient, don't raise their voice slightly when you hesitate, don't say things like, "Sir, every second counts," in a tone that sounds less like customer service and more like a poker player watching you almost fold. So I did something she wasn't expecting. I agreed with her. Enthusiastically, I told her yes, absolutely, let's secure my account right now, I'm so glad you called. And while she walked me through her script, a script I could tell she'd read hundreds of times before, the way you can tell an actor has said the same line in 40 different takes, I opened my laptop and started writing down everything, every phrase, every hesitation, every time she stumbled slightly off book when I asked a question she wasn't prepared for. I asked for her employee ID number. She gave me one too fast, like she'd memorized it along with everything else. I asked which branch she was calling from. She named the one 9 minutes from my apartment, the one that, as I quietly pulled up on my second monitor while keeping her on the line, had closed for renovations 4 months earlier and wasn't accepting calls at all. That was the first lie. It wouldn't be the last, and it wouldn't be the most important one. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I wasn't just some guy who might panic and hand over an account number out of fear. I do something for a living that made me, without her realizing it, exactly the wrong person to pick for this particular con. And by the time she finished her script and asked me to confirm my identity one final time, I had already decided I wasn't going to give her my money. I was going to give her something else entirely. I stayed on that call for 11 more minutes, feeding her just enough hesitation, just enough confusion, just enough almost convinced silence to keep her talking, keep her invested, keep her thinking the fish was still on the hook. Every minute she spent with me was a minute another script wasn't landing on someone who might not have hung up in time. Every question I asked her, every detail she gave up trying to sound more official, was a thread, and I am very, very good at pulling threads. When I finally hung up, my hands weren't shaking from fear anymore. They were shaking because I had just decided something, sitting alone on my couch at 20:26 in the afternoon, that I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. They wanted my money, and I was about to make sure they never got it. But that decision alone wasn't going to be enough, because 9 hours and 21 minutes later, someone was standing outside my apartment door, knocking 3 times, in a way that told me this had stopped being a phone call a long time ago. I want to take you back 9 hours, because the space between that phone call and the knock on my door is where the real story lives. Most people who get scammed, or almost get scammed, walk away from the call and go on with their evening. They tell their spouse about it over dinner, maybe post a warning on the neighborhood app, and move on with a healthy new distrust of unknown numbers. I did none of that. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and a decision I couldn't quite shake. You see, I mentioned I'd do something for a living that made me the wrong target. I work in digital forensics, not the glamorous television kind where someone types furiously for 8 seconds and suddenly has a suspect's home address, but the slow, patient, unglamorous kind. I spend my days tracing financial fraud for a living, testifying in court about spreadsheets and transaction logs, explaining to juries why a certain pattern of withdrawals tells a story more clearly than any confession could. I had spent 6 years getting very good at understanding how these operations work from the inside. Not because I wanted revenge on anyone, but because after watching what this kind of fraud did to an elderly client of mine 3 years ago, a woman who lost her husband's entire pension in one afternoon and hasn't fully recovered, something in me changed. I stopped seeing these calls as annoyances. I started seeing them as an open wound in the world that somebody needed to keep pressing on. So when this woman called me and gave me a fake employee ID, a closed branch address, and a rehearsed script with just enough cracks in it for someone trained to notice, I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt something closer to recognition. Like meeting an opponent you've studied for years without ever seeing their face. The details I'd written down during the call weren't much on their own. A voice, a cadence, a callback number that rerouted through 3 different relay services before it ended into nothing traceable, which is itself a kind of fingerprint if you know what you're looking at. A slight regional accent she was clearly trying to flatten out of her voice. And one crucial mistake. At the 9-minute mark, frustrated that I hadn't yet handed over what she wanted, she'd let a name slip. Not her own, she referred to someone else, quickly, quietly, the way you'd mutter to a coworker sitting beside you without realizing your microphone was still hot. Just get him off the line, we've got the Ohio batch still pending. The Ohio batch. 3 words that told me this wasn't one person working from a laptop in a bedroom somewhere. This was organized, structured. A batch implies a list implies a source, and a source implies somebody who had compiled information about hundreds, maybe thousands, of people like me, people who looked, on paper, exactly harmless enough to be perfect targets. I spent that afternoon doing what I do at my actual job, except this time nobody was paying me and nobody had asked me to. I cross-referenced the callback number pattern against a database of reported scam numbers that professionals in my field quietly maintain and share with each other. A kind of neighborhood watch for financial crime, mostly volunteer, entirely unglamorous. I found 6 other reports using nearly identical scripts, all within the past 5 weeks, all claiming to be from different banks, all somehow knowing account details that should never have been available to a stranger. 6 confirmed victims that I could find. God only knows how many hadn't reported it. Too embarrassed, too ashamed, too worried about what people would think of them for almost falling for something so obvious in hindsight, and so terrifying in the moment. That's the thing nobody tells you about these scams. They don't work because the people who fall for them are stupid. They work because fear is a language older than logic, and these people are fluent in it. They know exactly how long to pause before delivering bad news. They know the precise tone of voice that makes urgency sound like helpfulness. They know that a racing heart doesn't ask good questions. I'd spent 6 years studying that language from a safe distance, in courtrooms and case files. Now, for the first time, I'd heard it spoken directly at me, and instead of flinching, I'd taken notes. By 6 in the evening I had a working theory of how the operation was structured, based on nothing more than patterns, small mistakes, and the kind of pattern recognition that comes from doing this work far longer than felt healthy. By 8, I had done something I want to be very careful about how I describe, because there's a version of this story where I turn into the reckless hero who takes matters into his own hands and does something spectacularly stupid. And that is not the story I'm telling you. What I did was simple, quiet, and entirely legal. I compiled everything. The call recording, the callback number pattern, the slipped phrase about the Ohio batch, the cross-referenced victim reports, into a single, organized file, and I sent it to 2 places. My local field office's fraud division, and a financial crimes task force I'd worked alongside twice before on unrelated cases. Then I did the one thing that, in hindsight, was probably the reason my doorbell rang at 11:47 that night, instead of just staying a story I'd tell at dinner parties for the rest of my life. I want to be honest about why I called that number back. Because it wasn't bravery, and it wasn't recklessness either, even though I can see how it might look like both from the outside. It was curiosity mixed with something colder, a professional itch I couldn't ignore. In 6 years of tracing fraud after the fact, sifting through the wreckage once the money was already gone, and the trail had gone cold, I had never once had the chance to be inside a live operation while it was still happening. Every case I'd ever worked was an autopsy. This was, for the first time, a pulse. The line rang 4 times before it picked up, and there was a beat of silence before anyone spoke. The kind of silence that told me someone had looked at a screen, seen a returning number, and hesitated. Then a different voice, not the woman from that afternoon. A man this time, younger sounding, trying too hard to sound older, the vocal equivalent of a kid wearing his father's blazer to a job interview. "Thank you for calling Account Security Services. How can I help you today?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the phrase was so aggressively generic, so obviously scraped together from 100 legitimate, sounding call centers, that it confirmed everything I already suspected. I didn't laugh though. I stayed calm, stayed pleasant, and told him I'd received a call earlier about unusual activity on my account and wanted to follow up, since I hadn't finished verifying things the first time. Here's what I need you to understand about the next 4 minutes, because they matter more than almost anything else in this story. I wasn't trying to catch him in a lie for my own satisfaction. I was buying time, deliberately, carefully, while a message I'd sent an hour earlier sat in the inbox of someone whose job was to trace exactly this kind of call while it was live. I kept him talking. I asked him to repeat the account, irregularities. I asked him, very politely, whether I could get a callback number that wasn't blocked. Since I liked to write things down for my records, I asked him to spell his supervisor's name, slowly, because I wanted to be sure I had it right. Every question I asked, he answered with a little too much confidence, and a little too little consistency. The bank he named this time wasn't the same one the woman had claimed to represent that afternoon. A detail he didn't seem to register as a problem, because in his mind, I was just supposed to be scared and compliant, not paying attention to details, not cross-referencing anything in real time. That's the design flaw at the heart of every one of these operations. They are built for panic. They are not built for someone calm enough to take notes. Around the 3-minute mark, I heard something in the background that I will never forget, because it's the moment the entire shape of this story changed for me. Underneath his voice, faint but unmistakable, I heard other voices. Not one person in a bedroom. A room full of desks, overlapping conversations, other scripts being read in other cadences to other people who were, at that exact moment, somewhere in the country, feeling their stomachs drop the way mine had 9 hours earlier. It wasn't one predator. It was a floor of them. I didn't say anything about what I'd heard. I thanked him for his time, told him I'd think about it and call back, and hung up before he could push harder. Then I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long moment, because something had shifted in me that I hadn't expected. This had stopped being about protecting my own money hours earlier. Now it felt like I'd accidentally opened a door into a much bigger room than I intended to walk into, and there was no version of this story anymore where I simply forgot about it and went to bed. I sent a second message that evening, this one far more detailed, including the ambient background noise as a data point, including the discrepancy between the 2 callers' claimed institutions, including my own professional background, so whoever read it would understand I wasn't a panicked civilian grasping at conspiracy theories, but somebody who did this kind of tracing for a living and recognized a structured operation when he heard one breathing on the other end of a phone line. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known sitting at that kitchen table, with my coffee gone cold for the second time that day, was that operations like this one don't just take your information and disappear into the ether. Sometimes when someone spends 11 minutes on a call refusing to be afraid, refusing to hand over the thing they came for, and then calls back on top of it asking sharper questions than a frightened Mark should ask, they don't just move on to the next name on their list. Sometimes they get curious about you instead. I didn't think about that possibility that evening. I went about my night the way anyone might after an unsettling but ultimately harmless string of phone calls. I made dinner, I answered a few emails, I told myself the hard part was over and the rest was now somebody else's job, somebody with a badge and legal authority I didn't have. I remember feeling, for the first time all day, something close to relief. That relief lasted until 11:47 p.m., when 3 deliberate knocks landed on my apartment door and I realized, with a cold and sudden certainty, that whoever was standing on the other side of it, it hadn't come to talk on the phone this time. I didn't get up right away. I want to be honest about that, because in every version of this story I've told out loud since, people expect me to say I leapt off the couch, grabbed something heavy, and marched to the door like a man with nothing to lose. That's not what happened. What happened is I sat completely still for the length of that knock, running through a very short, very unpleasant list of possibilities, none of which involved a neighbor borrowing sugar at midnight. 3 knocks, then nothing, no doorbell, no voice calling out a name, mine or anyone else's. Just silence, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, which is a sound I'd only ever read about in books before that night and always assumed was an exaggeration. I did 2 things at once, as quietly as I could manage. I texted the agent I'd been in contact with from the Financial Crimes Task Force, the one who'd responded to my second message, just 2 hours earlier, with a single line that had seemed almost too calm at the time. This is more active than we initially assessed. Do not engage further without us. And I moved, without turning on a single light, toward the window that overlooked my building's front steps, the one place I could see the door without opening it. There was a man standing there. Mid-30s maybe, dressed like he could have been anyone. A delivery driver, a lost rideshare passenger, somebody's cousin crashing on a couch nearby. That was the unsettling part. Not that he looked dangerous, he didn't. He looked deliberately unremarkable, which is its own kind of warning sign once you've spent 6 years learning to notice the difference between someone who blends in by accident and someone who's trained themselves to. He knocked a second time. Softer now, almost polite, like he was giving me the chance to answer on my own terms before he tried something else. And then he said something through the door, quiet enough that I had to lean toward the glass to catch it. I think we got disconnected earlier. Wanted to follow up in person. That single sentence told me more than an hour of research could have. Because I hadn't given anyone my address. Not the woman that afternoon, not the man on the second call that evening. I had given a bank account number's worth of nothing, verified nothing, confirmed nothing, except, I realized with a slow and creeping dread, my phone number, which I'd never bothered to block or spoof, because in 9 years of living in this apartment, I had never once considered that a scam call might be sophisticated enough to reverse engineer a home address from a mobile number, and whatever public records happened to be sitting around waiting to be stitched together. I hadn't just been targeted by a script. I'd been targeted by an operation with resources, patience, and apparently, the willingness to escalate from a phone call to a physical visit when the phone call didn't go according to plan. That should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, something colder and more useful took over, the same instinct that had gotten me through the phone calls earlier that day. Stay calm. Stay quiet. Don't confirm anything. By time, I didn't answer the door. I didn't turn on lights. I sent a second text, this one considerably less composed than the first, and within 90 seconds that felt like standing underwater, I got a reply telling me units were already close, closer than I'd realized, because apparently my second message from earlier that evening had triggered exactly the kind of response I hadn't known to expect. This wasn't a lone scammer anymore. This was, as it turned out, the tail end of a much larger investigation that had been building for months, one that my 2 phone calls had unknowingly handed a live thread to pull. The man outside knocked one more time, waited about 20 seconds in a silence so complete I could hear the building's old radiator ticking somewhere behind me, and then I heard footsteps retreating down the stairwell instead of continuing to try. Not panicked footsteps. Unhurried ones. The footsteps of someone who had decided, calmly and professionally, that this particular door wasn't going to open tonight, and there was no percentage in forcing the issue. I stood at that window for 11 minutes after he left. The same number, I noted later with a strange kind of grim humor, as the minutes I'd kept the first caller on the line that afternoon. Watching the street below, waiting to see if he'd circle back, waiting to see headlights that never came, waiting for a version of the night that, thankfully, didn't happen. What I didn't know yet, standing in my dark living room with my phone gripped so tightly my knuckles had gone pale, was that the man at my door wasn't there to hurt me. He'd been sent to assess something. To find out, in person, whether the person who'd asked one too many sharp questions on 2 separate calls that day was simply lucky, or whether he was something more dangerous to their operation than a single, uncooperative mark. I was about to find out that the answer to that question was going to matter a great deal more than I ever expected. Not just for me, but for the 6 confirmed victims I already knew about, and for a batch of names in Ohio that I hadn't stopped thinking about since I first heard them mentioned on a phone call. I was never supposed to survive with my curiosity, let alone my money, intact. The call came at 6:12 the next morning, earlier than I'd expected, in that gray hour when the city hasn't decided yet whether it's still night or already day. It was the agent I'd been texting, Delgado, I'll call her. Though that's not her real name, because some of what I'm telling you now involves an investigation that technically isn't finished, even all this time later. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked if I was safe, if the man had left, if anyone had followed him. Then she asked me to come in later that morning and walk through everything again, slowly, on the record this time. What I learned sitting across from her in a windowless room that smelled like old coffee and new carpet was bigger than anything I'd pieced together on my own. The operation wasn't a scattered handful of scammers working out of someone's garage. It was a call center, a real one, with shift schedules and quotas and, chillingly, a break room, operating out of a rented office space 2 states away, using stolen data from a breach nobody had publicly reported yet, feeding scripts to dozens of callers who worked their way down lists organized by region, income bracket, and age. The Ohio batch I'd heard mentioned wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal spreadsheet, a list of names and numbers slated for calls that week, and mine had been on a different one entirely. A smaller, secondary list reserved for what Delgado called verification failures. People who hadn't panicked. People who'd asked the wrong questions. People worth a second look, because in an operation built on volume and fear, the rare person who didn't flinch was either nobody worth worrying about, or somebody who might be a problem. I'd been flagged, it turned out, not because I'd done anything reckless, but because I'd done everything a scared, ordinary person wasn't supposed to do. I'd stayed calm. I'd asked for names. I'd called back. In the strange economics of a criminal operation that depends on speed and terror to work, a person who slows the process down and starts asking precise questions is a liability worth investigating, and that, more than any amount of money in my account, was what had put a stranger on my doorstep at 11:47 p.m. The visit itself, and this part took weeks to fully confirm, hadn't been an escalation meant to threaten me into compliance. It had been reconnaissance. A quiet, low, risk check to see whether the person on the other end of 2 unusually composed phone calls was a fluke, a professional, or worse, someone already talking to people who mattered. When I didn't answer the door, and when whatever surveillance they'd done afterward turned up the fact that a financial crimes task force had received 2 detailed reports from my number within the same 12-hour window, the calculation on their end apparently changed very quickly. Delgado told me, with the kind of flat, professional understatement law enforcement seems to specialize in, that the timeline accelerated significantly after that. 3 weeks later, that call center was raided. I wasn't there for it, obviously, and I didn't find out until Delgado called to tell me, in the same even tone she used for everything, that they'd made 11 arrests, seized records tied to over 400 attempted or completed frauds across 6 states, and confirmed a direct connection between the scripts used on me and at least 2 of the earlier reports I'd cross-referenced myself, including one involving an elderly widow in Ohio who had mercifully hung up before losing anything. I think about that woman sometimes. A person I've never met and never will, whose name I don't know, who is alive and whole and unrobbed today in part because a phone number on a spreadsheet got flagged as verification failure instead of successful transfer. I think about the version of that night where I answer the phone that afternoon distracted, tired, not paying attention, and hand over exactly what they wanted in the first 90 seconds, the way I'm sure hundreds of other people did before that call center's door finally got kicked in. They wanted my money. That was the whole plan, the entire mechanism. Fear traded efficiently for cash, over and over, at scale, across a spreadsheet full of names that weren't supposed to fight back. And for one afternoon and one very long night, they came very close to getting both the money and, if that man's knock had gone differently, something considerably worse than money. But they got neither. Not because I was fearless. I want to be clear about that, because I don't think fearlessness is really the lesson here. I was afraid. My hands shook. My heart was loud enough in my ears to keep me company for most of that night. What I had, instead of fearlessness, was 6 years of training that taught me fear doesn't have to be the one driving, even when it's sitting right there in the passenger seat refusing to be quiet. I still live in that apartment. I still keep my blinds closed a little more carefully than I used to, and I'll admit that certain knocks still make my stomach drop for half a second before my brain catches up. But every so often, I get an update from Delgado, a court date, a plea deal, a sentencing, and I'm reminded that the story didn't end with me protecting my own account balance. It ended with a room full of people who spent their days manufacturing panic for a living finally running out of people willing to be afraid of them. They wanted my money, not me. I made sure they got neither, and it turned out, neither was a far bigger word than I ever expected it to be. People ask me, more than a year later, why I still tell this story at all. The case is closed. The 11 arrests turned into convictions, most of them plea deals, a few actual trials that I sat through as a witness, reading from the same legal pad I'd scribbled on that first afternoon while a stranger's voice told me my bank account was in danger. The spreadsheet with my name on it is evidence now, locked in a file somewhere, one line among thousands. By every measure that matters to a courtroom, this story is finished. But I keep telling it, because the ending everyone wants. The raid, the arrests, the tidy justice of it, isn't actually the part that changed how I live. The part that changed me was smaller and quieter than that. It was the 6 seconds between the phone ringing and me deciding to answer it. It was the 4 seconds where fear almost drove instead of me. It was standing in a dark living room at midnight, choosing stillness over panic, not because I was brave, but because I'd trained myself, without ever expecting to need it personally, to recognize the exact shape of manufactured urgency. That's the thing I actually want to leave you with. Not the raid, not the arrests, the 6 seconds. Because statistically, one of you reading this will get that call. Maybe not this year. Maybe not from this exact operation. There are others, plenty of others, each one running the same playbook with slightly different words. A voice that knows just enough real information to sound legitimate. A tone that gets a little sharper every time you hesitate. A countdown that exists only to keep you from thinking clearly. And in that moment, you will not have 6 years of forensic training to lean on. Most people don't. That's not a flaw in you, it's the entire design of the con. It is built, engineered, refined over thousands of calls, specifically to exploit the fact that fear is faster than reasoning. So here's what I tell people instead of the training I happen to have. Real institutions do not create urgency designed to stop you from thinking. If someone on the phone is speeding you up, that itself is the tell. Slow down on purpose, because that's the one move their script isn't built to survive. Hang up and call the number printed on your actual card or statement, not one they give you, not one that shows up conveniently on your caller ID. And if anyone ever asks you to move money quickly to protect it, understand that no legitimate protection in the world requires speed as its main ingredient. Fraud does. Protection never does. I don't know what happened to most of the 11 people arrested that day. I know a few names from court filings, but they don't matter to this story, not really. What matters is the woman in Ohio who hung up before losing her husband's pension, whom I've never met and never will, Who has no idea a phone call I refuse to be afraid of played some small part in a chain of events that led to her name being removed from a spreadsheet before anyone got to use it? What matters is the version of that night where I don't reach for my legal pad, where I hand over what they asked for in the first 90 seconds out of simple, human fear. A version of that night that happens to real people every single day and isn't their fault when it does. They wanted my money. That was true from the first ring of the phone to the last knock on my door. What they didn't count on was that some doors, when they finally get knocked on, knock back. I made sure they got neither. And if this story does anything at all beyond passing an evening, I hope it means that the next time your phone rings with that particular flavor of urgency in a stranger's voice, you remember there were 6 seconds where I almost gave in too, and I didn't, and neither should you. It's strange, sitting here writing the last part of something that technically ended over a year ago, in a courtroom I don't visit anymore. But endings are rarely as clean as the paperwork makes them look, and I think I owe you the parts that don't show up in any police report, because those are the parts that actually stayed with me. A few months after the trials wrapped, I got a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual letter, forwarded through the task force because the sender didn't have my address, only my name from a court filing that had gone briefly public. It was from a woman in her 70s, 3 states away, who wrote that she'd gotten a call almost identical to mine, word for word in places, 3 weeks before the raid happened. She'd almost given them everything. Her daughter had walked in halfway through, heard the tone of the call, and made her hang up. She said she'd read about the case in her local paper, seen my name mentioned as the witness, whose reports helped trigger the investigation, and just wanted someone to know that the 6 seconds I keep talking about had reached further than I'd ever be able to measure. I don't know if her call came from the same operation. I'll never know for certain. But I keep that letter in a drawer I don't open often, because some days I need the reminder that none of this was really about me at all. I also want to tell you the part I usually leave out, because it doesn't make for a satisfying ending, and I'm suspicious of stories that only include the satisfying parts. The fear didn't fully leave when the case closed. For months afterward, unknown numbers made my chest tighten in a way they never had before. I'd let calls ring out that were probably just my dentist confirming an appointment. Delgado told me that was normal, that it happens to almost everyone who's been on the sharp end of something like this, whether they lost money or not, whether a stranger showed up at their door or not. Fear doesn't check your bank balance before it decides whether you're allowed to keep feeling it. It took time, ordinary boring time, not a dramatic turning point, before answering my phone stopped feeling like a small act of bravery. I tell you that not to undercut the ending, but because I think it's the more honest one. You don't walk away from something like this and simply return to who you were before. You walk away slightly rebuilt, more careful in some ways, less trusting in others, and hopefully, if you're lucky, a little more useful to the people around you, because of what you now know how to recognize. So here is where I actually want to leave this story, for good this time. Not with the raid, not with the arrests, not even with the letter from the woman in the drawer. I want to leave it with the phone in your hand, right now, tonight or tomorrow or 6 months from now, when it rings with a number you don't recognize and a voice that knows just enough about you to sound real. I want you to remember that urgency is a weapon before it's ever a warning, that real institutions have never once needed you to panic in order to help you, and that the 6 seconds between the ring and your answer belong entirely to you, no matter how convincing the voice on the other end sounds. They wanted my money. They wanted the money of everyone on that spreadsheet, everyone in that Ohio batch, everyone whose name got typed into a list by someone who saw a person and calculated a number instead. For one afternoon and one long, dark night, I made sure they got neither, not the money, and not me, not my fear, not my compliance, not my silence afterward. And now that you've heard the whole thing, start to finish, you have something I didn't have that afternoon the phone rang. You have the 6 seconds already rehearsed in your mind before you ever need them. Use them, slow down, hang up, call back on your own terms. Because somewhere out there right now, another spreadsheet is being built, and the only thing that decides whose name gets crossed off it is whether the person on the other end of that call remembers, in time, that they get to choose fear or they get to choose thought, but never both at once. They wanted my money, not me. I made sure they got neither. That's the whole story. What you do with the 6 seconds is yours.